All right, so we'll jump right into it. We're here to have a conversation about how youth engage in sort of political actions in the political system and move us forward. So first I want to start off by inviting our panel to introduce themselves. Yeah, we can go right down the line.
Yeah, good morning, folks. And it's a pleasure to be back here at Youth-Nex. Of course, it makes me think what Robert Frost once said about the older I get, the younger are my teachers. So, but again, it's good to be here. My name is Aaron Hazelton. I'm the Global Director for Citizen Participation and Inclusion at the National Democratic Institute. We're a global organization with activities in more than 70 countries. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. We work to support both governmental and non-governmental organizations that are seeking to reform democratically, secure human rights, and pursue sustainable development objectives.
To be a leader among people who don't appreciate leading young ideas has been challenged. Right after I was elected as the coalition leader, couldn't execute my mandates, like placing members in committees. They saw it, or rather despised the fact that a person under the age of 35 is advising them to be in which committees, building solidarity across generations in a way to challenge stereotypes about young people, ensure that young people's perspectives are represented, strengthen collaboration, help young people gain access to power. Today's young people need real opportunities to participate in politics and contribute practical solutions that advance development. When they're able to organize, voice their opinions, and play meaningful roles in decision making, today's youth can contribute to positive and lasting change.
Young people are the bridge between the identification of concrete problems and the path to the political solution.
We think that benefits of adults and young people working together are sharing knowledge
and experience gain,
and access to resources.
Rich experience of older generation coupled with decent education of youth inevitably establishes intergenerational partnership.
Intergenerational partnership requires respect,
cooperation, collaboration,
require mutual understanding.
Trust that adult political actors will fulfill promises made.
Requires voices from all genders.
Especially that of young girls are well represented in policy making and implementation.
The benefit of adults and young people working together is the empowered youth.
We have more power to make the world a better place for everyone.
To help decrease generational gap.
It creates mutual understanding.
Që do të thotë vlerësimi e të rinjve duke I pranuar zërat e tyre ndryshe.
Birinciden yaş aktivistler tajirba alshat, ikinciden mesele onoj çeşitlet.
Dhe të shfillojnë politika që I përgjigjen nevojave specifike të gjeneratave të reja.
They make youth active participants in decision making.
It helps in developing the right policies of the younger generation.
Krijimi I partneriteteve mes brezave kërkon një qasje politike më gjithëpërfshirëse.
Gjithëpërfshirja është një rrugë e nevojshme drejt një shoqërie me vlera demokratike.
Will enable young people to learn and then create the type of society we want to live in.
Establishes sustainable cities and communities.
It will enable young people to make their contributions to nation building.
The quality of our future depends on the quality of intergenerational collaboration now.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Josefina Bañales. I am an assistant professor in community psychology at the University of Illinois in Chicago, from Chicago, born and raised in Chicago, south side of Chicago. Where's my Chicago people at? Hey! So I'm a community developmental psychologist. So essentially what that means is that I do work for my people and my community. I engage in youth participatory action research, particularly with youth of color. So it's been Black youth, Latinx youth, around supporting them to engage in a critical racial consciousness. So developing beliefs, feelings, and actions that challenge racism and starting to think more about that through a healing lens.
Hello, my name is Dr. Johari Harris. I'm an assistant professor at Kennesaw State University. I just left here last year. I'm so happy you did a shout out because I want to shout out my Y table. Hey, hey coach, hey Cassie. But so my work is really interested. I come from the school context. So how do students and teachers, how do we talk about and think about race and ways we can create justice-oriented citizens and the ways we use developmental science in that process. So I'm very excited to be here.
Okay, all right, so we're gonna go ahead and jump right into it because we have a list of questions and I'm hoping we can get through them. The first question is intended to just kind of level set, and it's actually based off of the assumption that undergirds this year's entire conference. The conference's theme assumes that youth voice and agency in politics is a good and necessary thing. And so I just want to know I want to engage that assumption directly and ask the question, why is this still a necessary point to make? And what keeps it from being a widely held belief? Whoever wants to take it first.
What you said to me? Oh, I love this. I do love this one. I'm gonna have you shine.
I appreciate the alley-oop. Well, and Dr. Scott is like an amazing moderator because we like connected yesterday. We were already like co-creating and discussing responses because this is just like my favorite question. So I was thinking about this morning around how recently, I would say within the past 10 years, but especially in the past 6 years, we've seen like this uptick in theoretical models made by women of color, particularly in developmental psychology and community psychology, like women of color, Black women, Afro-Latino women, Mexican women, Puerto Rican women, who have really been pushing the youth civic engagement research forward. And the youth civic engagement research, essentially this body of work that understands how youth engage in their communities, right? How they engage in politics, how they engage in civics, how they develop this thing called agency we've been talking about, right? That capacity to engage in their communities. And it's been pretty color evasive. It hasn't really, these major models in our field and these literatures have been really, they don't directly center and challenge white supremacy. So by using broad definitions of youth agency, what that opens you up to say is that, well, technically there were youth, there on January 6th at the insurrection, engaging in youth voice. They were engaging in youth agency. And so this recent challenging from women of color, particularly in creating more critical frameworks that really challenge white supremacy and say, what we are talking about is facilitating and supporting youth of color, as well as white youth, to be critical of white supremacy and systems, to challenge white supremacy, cis heterosexual patriarchy in systems of oppression. And that's what we are talking about. We are talking about youth using their voices to challenge oppression, which includes whiteness, which includes white supremacy. And so that's really where I come from, really not using general youth development frameworks, because what that happens is that, again, it leaves you open to say that this is a neutral thing, which it's not a power neutral thing.
Yeah, she said it wonderfully, and I just want to add to that this idea that I feel like certain communities, it's never been neutral. Often when we talk about, and let's just name it, within this kind of mainstream, often the gatekeepers are white. It's been neutral to them, but if we look at Black and brown communities, civic engagement has always been focused on justice and focused on how do we create these equitable spaces throughout history. And so I think it's great that finally it's being elevated in these academic spaces. But I can imagine people who are working on the ground are saying, like, well, this isn't new to me. Like I've been doing this with my students. I've been doing this with my youth. And I just think it's wonderful to kind of just continue to elevate that work when we talk about the need for youth agency and voice, because we know when it comes to money, and that kind of came up yesterday on a panel, like, the money piece is huge. And so oftentimes money is attached to these gatekeepers. And so let's just continue to elevate the criticality of youth agency.
Hard acts to follow. Maybe to zoom out a little bit, because my work is global, and particularly in the global South. And a history of colonialism, I think, feeds some of those same types of trends. But it's a little bit different, right? In places like Nigeria, the problem is patriarchy. You know, in other places around the world, it's oligarchy, right? The work we do with young people, we kind of couch it within a larger and more maybe existential challenge, which is kind of an ongoing battle, and we're seeing it play out here in this country, between democracy and authoritarianism. In young people, in more broadly, marginalized communities are kind of caught in the middle. And, you know, if you start to look at it from an intersectional perspective, you know, young people who are members of the LGBTQI plus community, or young people with disabilities, or young people from indigenous communities suffer the most under these circumstances, right? But they're also at the same time on the front lines of trying to bring about change. You know, you see this play out right now in Iran. You know, it's a women's-led movement there. You see young people on the streets in places like Hong Kong. So young people, I mean, their desire for change is critical. And the work that we do is not only intended to support what it is that they want to see change or transform, kind of meeting them where they are, but for us, it's a matter of trying to create a next generation of small d Democrats, people that are willing to demand and defend democracy going forward. Because the slip toward authoritarianism, again, is you know, kind of progressing much more rapidly than we would have thought just a few years ago.
Okay, I think that marks a good pivot to the next question, which speaks to the different sort of context and the issues that are most salient or most pressing in those contexts, right? Because there are local issues, and then there are national issues, and then there are some issues that are international or global. And so looking at those different levels, picking one or all, what are some of the things that you've learned about in your work about youth's sort of level of political awareness when we talk about the context that they focus on?
I'll jump in. I mean, if you use the perspective of all politics as local, I think, you know, the young people that we interact with around the world are very politically aware when it comes to understanding kind of the challenges within their community. You know, they all have different types of aspirations. They may not aspire, you know, to be, you know, kind of to participate in formal politics, but there's a strong desire to engage in processes of change. So from that perspective, I think they're inherently political. And a lot of the support that we provide is, and this is a lesson learned, right, is intended to meet young people where they are in terms of that issue or that cause that they feel most passionate about. And, you know, we try to put our money where our mouth is. I manage a global small grants program designed specifically for LGBTQI plus organizations and disabled persons organizations, but with a focus on youth-led activism. Because what we found is, well, two things, right? I mean, it's more powerful in terms of helping those young people really develop a sense of efficacy and building power when it is an issue they care about, right? I mean, that probably goes without saying. The other piece, though, is globally within the LGBTQI plus movement and within the disability movement, and this is the same for women's movement as well, young people are marginalized even within those movements. So we're trying to pay particular attention to the young people that are, you know, trying to make their voices heard within the movement themselves and assume some level of leadership. And then, you know, that's from the internal, and then moving that to the external, right? So we make an investment through our small grants program in that type of activism to try to elevate young people and try to ensure a more distributive leadership, I guess. And it's different in every country, right? I mean, the way in which those movements take shape and how they kind of connect within the country and regionally is a little bit different. But that problem of youth being marginalized even within those communities is true kind of universally.
So yeah, I would definitely agree with the idea that, you know, politics is local, and it makes me think. I think it was Diana Bryant said yesterday. You know, she quoted author where my body is political. And so in the work that I do, mostly work with Black youth, and a lot with Black boys. And just in my conversations with him, I remember one, and he started, and we weren't even talking about politics. It was a different conversation about kind of pro-social behaviors. And he started talking about Trump, and he was just like, well, he's not here for us. And that kind of succinct statement talked about or demonstrated his analysis of how these social structures don't serve him as a young Black man in Southwest Atlanta. And so I think that we often don't even give credit to the kind of small conversation around politics that youth are having. And, it's not always kind of the social media campaign or the person participating in the march. They're thinking about it and communicating it with adults in their lives, peers in their lives, trying to make sense of what they do next in these spaces. And so, I would say too, it's starting younger and younger. I remember I lived, and this was years ago, I lived in South Africa, and this was when, I think it was Zimbabwe's government was under peril, and it was Mugabe was the leader at the time. And these kids were like fighting with each other. He was like, this is why you're like Mugabe. And I was like, what? Like, these are like calling each other dictators or digs. So, in that moment, they are very aware of these like political spaces they're existing within. And again, it's not manifesting in the ways we're often familiar with, which is like showing up at the march or doing that protest. But they're in these kind of like micro moments that I think we should pay a lot more attention to, because so much change can happen in those spaces.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think what that brings up for me, what Dr. Harris says, is around what counts, as civic engagement, right? What do we see as legitimate? And a lot of, the youth that I work with, so like undocumented youth who are the first, right? So youth who are the first in their family to speak English, their family speaks another language. And like the youth I work with, their parents are from Latin America, they speak Spanish, right? And so these kids are language brokers, right? They're translating. They are literally helping their families navigate the United States political system. So they are socializing their families and their parents for political, civic, and survival purposes in the United States, right? That is absolutely a form of civic and political engagement that we wouldn't often necessarily consider a form of civic political engagement according to like our, typical ways, like Dr. Harris just said, right? The voting, the volunteering. And so again, what counts, right? And again, like folks, like when you're the first person in your family to do the thing, right? Like maybe you're the first person to go to college. Think about all that sharing you did, right? To bring that knowledge back to your sisters and your brothers and your communities, right? You're socializing. Same if you're the first person in your family with citizenship status, right? Or you're the first person in your family to speak English. You're bringing all this knowledge about, the civic political world back home. And so I think a lot about this interface between, what youth are doing in their families, right? With their communities, with their people, right? And how that's feeding back into this larger political system.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Pick up on that, because I think it's a global phenomenon in some respects. I mean, this notion that kind of young people want to organize differently. In a lot of cases, they want to they want to organize around existing institutions and processes, because they understand that those institutions and processes don't necessarily serve their interests, or they move too slow, wherever the case may be. So, legitimizing, kind of new forms of organizing and activism, I think is really critically important, in that, not everything needs to be done in such a formal and often, kind of hierarchical way. I mean, we can flatten it out, we can distribute leadership, and we can find different ways to help people organize and act to bring change. At the same time, you can't ignore some of those formal institutions and processes. And a lot of the work that we do globally is with political parties in trying to bridge the divide that exists. And it's a chasm between political parties, not just in this country and young people, but everywhere. Bridge that divide, because at the end of the day, I mean, it's those parties and party leadership that make a lot of the decisions once they're in government, right? So you don't want to be completely disconnected, but at the same time, you want to ensure that they're responsive to and respectful of the position of young people.
I'm thinking about I guess sort of a theme that I'm hearing across the responses of youth wanting to be able to find new ways, or youth finding new ways to mobilize, and how that aligns up with this idea that in the literature we tend to be focused on particular types of activism and wanting to expand that. And we know that the research on youth political engagement points usually to specific spaces. So I'm just wondering, where are we not looking? Where do we need to be broadening the scope in terms of what activism looks like and what the spaces where it's occurring?
I can start with one thought. I get nervous by silence, right? So I think one area that bears some amount of exploration, and it doesn't come down to a particular set of tactics or anything. It's more, kind of more strategic, is places where intergenerational collaboration is working. We've been running over the last couple of years kind of a global campaign to bring attention to the need for, because I heard this yesterday. I mean, you can't expect young people, to single-handedly, kind of transform systems and institutions and change social norms, et cetera. That's not going to happen, and it shouldn't be their responsibility. So finding ways to foster intergenerational collaboration and looking at places where that's working, where young people and older, more established leaders are working together, kind of hand in hand, I think is important. And, we've been able to point to some examples from our work, kind of globally, but they're few and far between, to be honest with you, because it means ceding power and visibility, right? And, but if you believe in the idea, when, my background many, many years ago was community organizing, and, what I was taught then is if you don't care who gets the credit, then it's all good, right? I mean, when you start caring about who gets the credit, it becomes a problem, right? So, but anyway, I mean, a lot of kind of older, more established leaders, kind of care deeply about who gets the credit, right? And so things like that need to be broken down, and we have some emerging examples of that. But again, I think fostering more of that would be really important.
Yeah, I think a lot about how, a lot of the work, so like similar to like you, Jahari, like the work like we do, like talking about race with young people, or organizing around challenging racism with young people. Like historically, like I always thought that I would always do this work in schools, right? I'm like, that's where it needs to happen, right? Like youth are there pretty much all day, right? They're like learning about race in implicit ways and explicit ways. So I think historically I was always like, oh, I'm going to do all this research in schools. And I did a little bit of that, but what I'm finding now is that like we're kind of moving out of schools because of, all of the barriers, right, and differences and geographic region and policy around like what you can and can't say around race, right? Like critical race theory. I know there's a question about this. I'm not gonna take too much on that, but and there's so many differences around, like we talked about teacher capacity and when you fit it in during the day. And so a lot of my work lately with young people has really been in like out of school time spaces. And it's really been like in this virtual space. We've talked about like the power of social media. So we've been doing a lot of organizing on Zoom because we've been connecting with youth across the country. And so Latinx youth who I work with, particularly like Mexican and Puerto Rican youth in Chicago, us wanting to, and the young people really driving this, them wanting to connect how the local issues in Chicago are not as different. Of course, there are unique differences in Chicago as compared to other states in the United States, but the young people there in Brighton Park, in Gage Park, right, wanting to connect with youth like in LA, because we see that like our lives are connected and issues affecting us in Chicago are affecting youth in LA or affecting youth in Richmond. And so a lot of our organizing lately has been on Zoom because we want to connect more of these local issues with these cross-national issues as well.
So, can you hear me? So it's funny because while you're talking about schools and the challenges they face, which are very real, I was saying, do people know the Jodeci song, like My Heart Belongs to You? Yeah, that's what I was thinking about with schools. It's like my heart belongs to schools. And it's like, even with all of the challenges and the issues like inherent in schools as they were created to be, I believe there's so much potential that can take place there. Especially, I loved how you were talking about, with first generation college students or first generation students or students who are translating for their families and the socialization that processes that take place. Like if we begin to look at the less obvious types of youth voice and the less obvious types of civic engagement that's taking place in K-12 schools, particularly in these, really crazy. So like I'm coming from Georgia where they just passed a law where you cannot talk about things like slavery and race. It's not even an executive order at this point. And yet there are still teachers who are like, well, I'm going to do this work. I'm just going to do it differently. And so I think one of the things I love about schools is they are like little micro democracies, particularly public schools, because you have students from all different backgrounds in this one little space where they can negotiate and figure out collectively what the solutions, whether it's like as small as like, how do we, share pencils, or as big as like, how do we change unjust structures within where we live or we learn, so to speak. And so I think, the schools definitely have their challenges, but I think we can continue to do that work, but moving away from those traditional markers. Like, do you know the 3 branches of government? Do you know who like the 5 presidents are? That's really not relevant. Or I don't want to say but it's not as relevant as some other pieces when it comes to justice and agency.
So this question I'm about to, go ahead.
Can I build on?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think about like Kiara's, right? I don't know if Kiara Alexander, right? Hey, Kiara. Kiara said this yesterday, right? Around like teachers, right? You were speaking directly to teachers and educators. You're like, don't push us away from social media, incorporate it in the classroom, right? And what comes up for me is that like, these are all interconnected systems, right? Like you cannot do without school. You absolutely cannot do without school. And you absolutely cannot do without social media, right? You are encouraging us to reimagine how we see these things as connected, right? Similar to the out of school time space, right? Can't get rid of that either, right? And so I just think about how do we think about connecting these different systems and institutions to support young people's agency and to think about more creative ways on how we can work together to support young people to challenge oppression. And so that's what comes up for me, what you said yesterday.
So I'm gonna ask a question that's not on the list, but it's coming up for me in your responses because I'm hearing the use of the terms civic engagement and political engagement. And so in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about civic education and political education. And I'm thinking about how those things are often, the terms are used interchangeably, but I don't necessarily know that they're the same thing. So I'm just wondering if you could clarify for the listeners, like, how do those things relate to one another, and how does that factor into what you all do?
What do you think, Aaron? As he asks questions off the list, what do you think?
I think it's an interesting question that, we could spend all day unpacking it, right? For us, we talk in terms of democracy education, and it's more, kind of applied, right? So, kind of models of action civics would probably be the closest comparison. But we do a lot of what would, I guess, traditionally be considered civic political education, right? It's kind of embedded in most of our programming and support, but is geared toward what do I need to know now to take an action, to connect, to relate, to network, to communicate, right? So it's more practical. So there's that. It's more hands-on, but also with a dose of context, right? So what does your what does your national constitution say? What are the local laws on budget or kind of community development funding, whatever it is, right?
And you're presenting this to young people.
To young and old, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we have particular programs that are geared toward younger people, usually in the 16 to 25 for what I just described, age category. And I think that those demographic differences are important. And make distinctions about different age groupings, and even the diversity within those age groupings, I think, is also really important to keep in mind. But I think, and you did have a question about, kind of changing the content of civic or democracy education curriculums to include things like media literacy, or in our case, cybersecurity. A lot of the young people we work with are organizing using WhatsApp, for instance, right? So, I mean, cybersecurity training goes hand in hand with that type of organizing, or, cloud. How do you use the cloud in a way that's safe? I mean, because the authoritarian, I mean, there truly is what we would describe as an authoritarian playbook that's being shared across the globe, and things like cyber surveillance, disinformation, all kinds of things that are not only a threat to democracy, but they're often targeted at particular communities. Young people being one of them, because again, they're often kind of the ones taking the streets and are vocal. But members of the LGBTQI plus community in particular, the authoritarian playbook says dehumanize those populations, other them, right? Scapegoat them in some way, create fear around their organizing or their visibility, right? So a lot of the work that we do goes into, trying to counter that disinformation, those narratives, which means giving people a different set of tools than they would have needed, 10 years ago.
So the distinction between civic and political engagement. Yeah, it's interesting, right? So like this is like a thing like that, like we like academics do, it's like, what's the difference between this and that? And then how does that have implications for youth development? And so like the way like academics, at least I've seen like in my work, is that like civic has to do with like volunteering and community-based work. And then oftentimes like political engagement is more like interfacing with the political system and like laws, signing the petition, things like that. So that's like a thing in like academic research. But honestly, like this is why I rely on working with my youth partners and working with community organizers, like doing the work, right? So like I would ask my partners like at the YMCA, right? Like, does it actually matter? Does it actually matter to you all, the distinction between civic and political engagement, right? Like that's where I'm like, does it matter? If it does, then let's talk about it. Why does it matter? How does that relate to how you're working with young people? How does that matter with the opportunities you're providing them, or they're bringing to you to co-organize around this issue? If it does matter, then let's talk about that and then move accordingly. But if it doesn't matter, then I personally don't like getting caught up in like, is it civic? Is it political? Like, I mean, that's something like we, in academia kind of get like caught up in. But if it doesn't matter for y'all's work, then it just doesn't. It doesn't. We don't have to get caught up in terms. For me.
Ditto. Ditto. I mean, she took the words. That was exactly what I was going to say, is that for me, it's one of the same. And we often, and I don't want to take away from the importance of language. Like, I don't want to minimize that. But in academia, we get so caught up in language that we're ignoring the fact that the communities we're saying we're working in tandem with and for and with aren't paying attention to these fights. And so instead of just using time, let's just instead say, okay, I love that. What works for you? And we'll go from there and keep it moving. So yes, I don't have anything more to add.
Okay. No, and I appreciate that because it is a conversation that's happening, and I'm wondering about the extent to which it is a distraction from the work that we're trying to have happen. I want to re-engage the list of playing questions, but also re-engage this topic of like social media and tie it to this question of, okay, so youth are engaging and using social media, and then we know that there's this proliferation of authoritarianism that's taking place. And so that's raised concerns around the question of media literacy, right? So much so that for those who have been paying attention to the news, Illinois now requires media literacy as a part of its curriculum, like through legislation. And so it has me wondering, how is media literacy relevant to the youth political education and engagement question? And how are youth already demonstrating a level of media literacy?
I think I partially answered this. But the thing I would add, though, is what we're finding. And again, a lot of what we do is trying to foster different forms of intergenerational collaboration. So, we may be working with youth to take the lead, but with the expectation that, they will be engaging and collaborating with established civic and political leaders. In any event, on that particular question, it's the young people who are training the older people on these issues. I mean, so, we can provide them, and we have relationships with some of the big tech companies that do a lot of pro bono work in support of our programming. But the young people that we work with are so far ahead in most places that, they're able to, kind of tutor up, kind of other people within their movements or adults that they're working with. So, yeah, there's a lot they can learn, but there's a lot they already know.
I really like his point just about kind of what they're already coming to the table with. And it's funny to me when I think about media literacy programs, I'm like, they know so much more than us. So how are we going to teach them? It's just like, particularly with these different platforms. And I feel kind of remiss talking about social media, because I actually have none. So I don't know how they fully work. But like, I know, for example, TikTok is a huge source of knowledge, and you make these like little short form videos, right? And it's really fun. I'm not on a TikTok, but maybe I should be. But so yeah, it's hard for me to speak to it because it's like I don't fully understand it. But I think that's this bigger thing of like, okay, so and that's a space for youth voice to really be salient. Is like in Illinois, is like, who's at the table creating this media literacy program? Because if it's focused on Facebook, from what I hear, the youths don't like Facebook. Like, word on the street is that that's not used. So yeah, I think it's important, and as we are in this large disinformation, I think it's interesting too, because the people who are really being affected by disinformation, to my understanding, aren't necessarily youths. It's people our age who are going and voting and making decisions off of false information. So the fact that we're suddenly placing the issues we're seeing in adult populations on youth, where they are pretty sophisticated at using these platforms and understanding the different sources of knowledge and thinking critically about it, I think it's just really important that we build off their capacity in that space. But I also can't speak to it because I don't have it. So.
I think I'll just share an example of how this has like come up in the groups, like with the youth that I was mentioning earlier in Chicago. It's around like WhatsApp. I don't know if anybody's on like WhatsApp, right? Like immigrants, right? Like we're on WhatsApp. And so a lot of like information sharing happens on WhatsApp, right? So like you're sending like articles and videos. And so like they were talking about how like they're always checking their tia or their mama on WhatsApp because they're sending like stuff from like the DR to the US around like, it could be like a fear-mongering article or something. And the kid is like, no, mama, like that's not real, right? Like, and they're breaking down the source. And so that's just an example of, I will share on how like WhatsApp has been, this another social, social media. I don't know if I would call it that. I don't know, but it's a social platform, right? Where there's so much international information sharing. And the Latinx youth who I work with, they're like, there's just trash on there, and they're checking family members around their circulation of materials on WhatsApp because you can do family group chats on there. And so they're coming in and they're intervening to making sure that the article doesn't, circulate elsewhere.
So, similarly or relatedly, with respect to legislation, we know that legislation has been advanced in nearly 35 states that, if passed, would limit the conversations related to racism, the experiences of specific ethnic groups in the United States, and related topics. This legislation is commonly referred to as CRT bans. And so I'm wanting to know, what potential impacts might this have on youth political awareness and education?
I can start, and I guess I want to start by saying, and really stressing, like, this isn't new. Like, it feels new and it feels very immediate. And in many ways it is, but this pushback against progress is not new in American history. And I think anybody working on the ground in these schools, in the communities, can speak to other points where this has emerged. And I think people, in theory, yes, it might affect youth kind of political knowledge, but at the same time, I feel like at least if I'm thinking about the school context, I feel like the teachers who weren't doing that work, say, are going to continue to not do that work. The teachers who were doing that work are going to continue to do that work in the ways they can. And so this, and if we look back, like if I think about freedom schools and the ways in which in the 60s, in a very different context that we were in there, they had in full schools around socio-political engagement and how to do this work. And we see so many schools, like I think of about the abolitionist teaching network, and there's so many different ways to engage youth despite this legislation that is just another reaction in this reactionary culture in which white supremacy is working hard to hold on to its power. And so I just, that's another space of like, sometimes I don't like getting caught up in like breaking down the laws, because it's just not new. It's just a different iteration of what has continued within the American context. And
the work will continue, right? Like in out of school spaces, right? They're going to happen in the homes, right? Youth are still going to be having conversations with their parents, right? Parents are still going to be bringing this knowledge to their kids. Kids are going to be talking to other kids about this, information, right? On social media, right? DMing one another, talking, walking outside, right? So the work will continue. I mean, obviously that is troubling because we also can't deny that schools are a huge socializing space, right? Again, we've talked about this, but the work will continue.
Probably not in a position to really answer the question. I mean, it doesn't necessarily affect the work that we do overseas. I mean, in most cases, the educational system itself is fundamentally broken in terms of having schools that are safe and supplied and teachers that are able to show up to work, et cetera. So, I mean, it's a different set of circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So yesterday there was a little bit of discussion about this, but I'm wanting to ask directly, and related to the alignment or misalignment between youth priorities and those of politically enfranchised youth. So I'm just wondering if y'all could speak to where the opportunities are for folks to coalesce around shared concerns between both youth and adults.
This is actually a question I really liked, and it was something that I've thought of a lot of in this over the past day and a half, because I think importantly there is, we've been talking a lot about youth voice and the need and the need to elevate it. And what I also think of is what you spoke of is the need for like this intergenerational approach to learning, where we're not kind of siloing off adults in this process. Because I think about like within the African diaspora, elders are so important in knowledge and the ways we understand and learn. And it's not simply it's because you're young, you don't know anything, because you're older, you do. It's because you're wise, because you've learned and you've lived, and through that you transmit it through our conversations. And so I really think we have to continue to build that. I don't know the word, but we have to focus on the partnership rather than just like one teaching the other or vice versa. It's like what can be created collectively because I also think for generations within the Black community, we have had this culture of learning and listening to our elders. And if we look through movements, it has been like, if we look at the civil rights movement, it wasn't all elders and it wasn't all young people. It was this real coalition of everybody. And so if we really want to make change, we have to do it and move in these ways where one group isn't prioritized over another, say. It's like, how are we intentional about bringing everybody to the table and co-constructing solutions together? And and it's tricky to do, but I think it's just really necessary. And I can imagine you see that depending on the global spaces you work in. It's just this very different emphasis. And to me, there is this, how can I say this without getting in trouble? There's this, I don't want to get in trouble. I think in some of the ways we talk about youth voice, and I think Fantasy said it yesterday, there is this Eurocentric nature to it, because the reality is, depending on who you are with that voice, you might get killed or you might not be. You know what I'm saying? Like a Black boy can't speak up in the ways that a white boy can. And a lot of times when we talk about youth voice, we're talking about it in ways that we want Black and brown youth to emulate the ways white youth speak up in schools. And I don't think that's necessarily the solution. And so I just, I really think we have to think about the ways we bring both to the situation. And like my last point is when the sweet baby yesterday was talking about his mother and the conversations they were having, that made me think of these are, the type of conversations and relationships that create change and create so how do we replicate that instead of just elevating one versus the other or thinking there's a tension where there doesn't need to be.
So I think there are a lot of kind of examples of kind of coalescing around certain issues. And I mentioned Iran earlier. I mean, that's kind of a whole of society, kind of effort to demand basic rights and freedoms. It's young and old on the streets together. But maybe at a more kind of micro level, I mean, we found a lot of success, for example, working within the disability movement in different places around helping young people and older established leaders within the movement work on psychosocial disabilities. That's a place where there seems to be a lot of coalescing. There's a number of countries where we've helped foster that. And then education, schools, I mentioned it. I mean, that's young and old people in the places we work can get together behind education reform, both at a local level and at a national level. We're supporting some work happening right now in Albania in the municipality of Tirana, where many schools were destroyed because of an earthquake a couple years ago, and those schools are being reconstructed. But Albania is known for its extensive corruption, particularly on public procurement. So young people and parents are getting together to monitor the procurement process with the assistance of a local organization, which is also youth-led, just to make sure that those schools are getting rebuilt the way in which they're supposed to, and the procurement process itself is transparent. So I think you can find those types of examples. I mean, it takes some work to kind of surface them and define that issue where you can build that type of kind of collaboration. Mm-hmm. Where everybody feels kind of equal ownership. It's like, it matters to me just as much as it matters to you, and but maybe for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. And now you mark the pivot there of like what it can look like, but I'm just wondering if any others want to add on in terms of what it can look like for youth to for adults to effectively support those movements. Okay.
The idea of support, I think it needs to go back to co-creating. One isn't supporting another. It's like, how do we co-create together rather than simply being supportive, because everybody has to. I guess sometimes you got to fall back, but you know what I'm saying? It's like, how do we co-create rather than.
Can you speak to how you gauge that? Oh, this is also another question that's not on the list, but like. Yeah, and particularly navigating so your point of like sometimes you got to fall back. So how do we navigate moments where it's just simply promoting youth engagement versus when we're trying to advance a youth-led movement?
I mean, I'm a question asker, right? What do you need? But at the same time, I do appreciate the point around like, okay, now what are we gonna do? You know what I'm saying, right? Like, ask questions, what do you need? But also, like, do you have any questions? Like the adult, right? Like, are you coming prepared to this meeting, right? And we don't want to replicate like this mainstream dynamic of like, that's what we've been critiquing this during this 2-day conference, that adults often set the agendas. Adults often come, top down and say, okay, you're going to do this. So definitely ask the questions, but also you come prepared with some ideas as well, right? Because you're a part of this dynamic as well. It's a relationship. That's the ideal. You're developing a relationship, which means that you both contribute. But again, because the dynamic is imbalanced, right? I often ask more questions, but also come prepared to leverage your resources, if that's what you're coming with, right? The monies. We need them pay young people to share knowledge, right? Don't expect that it's going to be for free, right? And so that can be built into like, if you get a grant, right? There should be a line in there where it's to pay young people to share their knowledge. So using your resources, using the infrastructure, maybe you have a space in your org or at your university or at your particular work location where young people can come and work together in this space, right? Maybe you're buying food, so you're providing the shelter. Use your resources.
I would just second that. We have helped stand up a few advisory groups with young people, including youth with disabilities, and we pay them for that. And not only is it deserved on their part. I mean, I think it incentivizes those who we're working with to listen. I mean, because there's an investment and there's a return on that investment, right? So we do that. And I think it's an important practice. The same with budgeting for accommodation to ensure that everybody has access to whatever that space is. And sometimes that accommodation is paying for data for a phone, or making sure people are connected to the network, or whatever it might be. It's not just physical accessibility. I mean, it's access to the tools that they need to organize around whatever the issue is.
What are some things that can be done to promote youth well-being during political action and engagement?
We budget for that too. Again, I think that's important. I mean, if it's not in your budget, I mean, the support that we can provide, particularly through our small grants, has line items in there for kind of self-care and well-being. And we have a kind of a toolkit that allows us to kind of check in with groups on a regular basis, and either if they need something or they need to talk it out or whatever it is, maybe we can do that. But more often than not, we give them resources where they can find that support locally. I even, between us, I just approved an award yesterday for a group that, it's a woman-led disability organization, and not to be named country, who wanted to do a wellness retreat, right? And part of that was to come up with, kind of a 3-year strategy. So they had somebody come in for strategic planning to facilitate all that. But it was also, 2 days of massage therapy, right? Mm-hmm. All right. And then we write that in, and we fund that, right? And they determine that as their well-being and self-care need, right? And maybe something else, but it's been a long time in being able to get to the point where we can do that. And government auditors may eventually have some questions, but I think we have answers, so it's all good.
Well, I think panel 1 yesterday with our young leaders answered this question, right? The joy, right? The collective community care, right? Holding one another, caring for one another, allowing young people to just be young people, right? People were talking about just going home, relaxing. I mean, because this work can feel so heavy, right? Like, we're talking about systems of oppression that, we're talking about minoritized youth as well, right? Like, this is not some abstract thing. This is impacting you and your community, your family. And so having that time to heal, right? To step away and to be with your people, to regulate your emotions, right? And just to do other things, that have nothing to do with the movement, right? To just lean into the, making art, right? Ways that fill you up in community with your people.
Yes, I would definitely agree with what both Josie and Aaron, I knew your name, are saying. And I think there's also this element of allowing young people to occupy different spaces in this struggle. And so not everybody needs to be on the front line. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think we sometimes create very rigid ideals or ideas of like what political engagement looks like. And that might not fit for a personality or a person. So creating space to do different things. And then I also think, going back to the idea of like the micro pieces of civic and political engagement and building those up. So when it does come to these larger moments, making sure youth feel supported and have the capacity. And so something that comes to mind, and I'm going to shout out my Y table again for this. My son was in Y over the summer, and I remember when I would pick him up sometimes, they would have like their older kids doing the like pick up and drop off. So I remember one time like 14-year-old was like, "Who you picking up today?" I was like, "Sir." And I was messing with him. I was like, "Oh, you guys have a free labor." But what I loved was that like this was building this child's agency. He was just felt very empowered in this space. And to me, that translates into these other spaces to use their voice. And it doesn't have to be as explicit as we sometimes make it to be, of like these explicit, like, okay, you're going to go into this particular class to learn this particular skill. It can happen in these other moments that then translate and can be supportive when things do feel so overwhelming. And I love the point you made about how it's really not abstract. I feel like so often people talking about it is abstract, but for the youth we want doing this work, it's concrete. And can I just say too, I feel very weird saying youth because I consider myself a youth. This whole time I'm like, am I not? Have you felt? I'm like, am I not a youth? Am I not a youth? But yes, that is kind of like, building these kind of smaller pieces to support the larger process.
To add, team love, and then like I think oftentimes like young people who I've worked with, like there's this question about like, am I doing enough, right? Like who is an activist, right? Like, am I doing enough? And I think that this approach that Jahar is mentioning, right, around like, handing the folder out at the Y and these micro moments, like boost up that confidence, right? Yes, you're doing enough because we all have our unique roles, right? And that I think could reduce like that stress of, am I doing enough? Yeah, you're doing enough.
Can I just maybe got me thinking when you said, the term youth, maybe just pose a question. Maybe it's somewhat rhetorical. The term youth, so there's a debate going on, at least within the international development community, and in part it's kind of couched within kind of deliberations around decolonizing assistance. But the term youth, some are arguing that it's gendered, that it predominantly means young men in many parts of the world, and there's an argument for not using the term, and I think there's both sides. I think there's considerations around, because in the Middle East, for instance, Shabab means youth, but when you say Yalla Shabab, it means come on boys. So, I mean, there are places in the world where maybe that's the case, but I just put that out there for a rhetorical question, whether or not youth is a gendered term.
Well, it has me rethinking the sentence stems that I was going to use to help us close before we pivot into Q&A. But I'm going to offer them, right, just for y'all to contend with. The youth, finish these sentence stems. The youth are really good at
TikTok. No, just kidding. So in all seriousness, I think use, and I include my note, being creative in approaching these things in front of us. And so And if I go back to TikTok, maybe I have like this like jealousy towards it. That's why I keep talking about it. But just the ways in which youth have been using TikTok to break down these really big terms like capitalism. And, you know, like I see so many, like my sister will send me these funny little things about like breaking down Marxism first, you know, capitalism and all, and just the way to make this knowledge that we often see in academia as separate, accessible to people and communities that it's often ignored. And so I think there's a creativity to dealing with these continuing problems that is really admirable.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, you know, thinking outside the box and really challenging like mainstream notions of like gender and, you know, like binaries. You know, I think about like young people in my life who are like on the autism spectrum, right? And they are really creative and thinking and challenging notions of gender, right? Like, oh, I don't believe in that. Like, I don't believe in the gender binary, right? Like, I'm queer. And so like this, I think about like other intersections of like identity and experience that also relates to young people's ability to think creatively and outside the box to challenge like mainstream notions of like identity that I think that really can make, you know, adults, older people uncomfortable.
And just to add to that, I actually asked some members of my team and some colleagues abroad about these questions. So that there was some agreement around that young people, at least the ones we work with, are fantastic about grounding issues and bringing a sense of urgency to the things they're working on.
Mm. And then to close us out, because I see this 0 minutes, but I want to hear it. The youth taught me
to listen, of course, I stopped listening the other day when my daughter called me. She's a campus organizer and said that they had started an anarchist book club. That gave me pause. I'm still pondering that one.
I guess that's such a good question because I feel like I'm like, oh snap, I didn't even think of that. To use your word, urgency, you know, just I feel like they kind of continue to push me to move towards action rather than, you know, just being in academia. So much of it is about, you know, the thought of it all. And I feel like they really push me towards action and, okay, what does this mean? Like, why are we talking about this? What are we going to do about it? And, you know, I think that's
yeah. I think just continued reflection, right? Like, I just think like the work is evolving, right? Like we as individuals are evolving ideally. And I think, right, like young people are not a monolith. There's so many differences, right? Within group differences, like we say youth, but youth are at different places in their own critical consciousness development, their own agency development. So there's not this one size fits all approach, you know, when working with young people. And so I think youth have taught me to step back and to reflect and to think about carefully, who am I working with and what are their needs? As opposed to, again, this collective youth, because there's so many differences.
Okay. Well, let's, I guess, give our panel a round of applause and then we'll pivot to questions.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. So I need help. Kiera mentioned yesterday she's a part of a group called Emerging Leaders. And so December, their professional development will be on civic engagement. So there's a third-party group that's going to come in, grassroots organizing group that's going to come in and train them. And then they'll go in January, meet with legislators, and then they'll sit in general session. How can I get out of the way, putting all that stuff together as an adult and connect them to more global and more national student-led groups so that they can be more connected to civic engagement. It's not just me kind of setting up these opportunities and experiences for them. I want them to be able to lead that work, but I'm also giving them space to learn more about how they can use their voice. So how can I get out of their way and connect them to other student-led groups that they can be empowered to be a global leader, to think like a global leader?
Yeah, I think it's great that you're thinking about like your positionality and your connection with the young people in the space, and ultimately you want to support, right? Like that's the essence of your question, and you don't want to take over. So I appreciate that. I wonder, if y'all might like, and I don't know what the pre-planning looks like, but I wonder if like you're in a group and you asked them like, what kind of groups are you interested in? Like, have you looked into anything? Or maybe even one of those meetings you all like do research together, around like the groups, as opposed to maybe like coming with the list of groups that you found on your own. Like, I wonder if you all can have like working sessions together where you do that work. And I also wonder if, again, with asking like, how can I support you? I think sometimes like the adult liaison position can actually be very helpful, right? Take the administrative load off of the young people, right? Like do the behind the scenes. We don't need you to speak at the event, but be behind the scenes, right? Email the people, you set up the payments, right? So maybe that position actually could be helpful, the more behind the scenes work, but I wonder maybe if, you all getting in a shared space and doing work together and saying, oh, do you actually want me to be behind the scenes? Or maybe they want you to be more in the forefront with them. I wonder. Thank
you. Good morning, everyone. This is Channing again. Nice to see everybody this morning. Thank you all for your lovely comments. And what I appreciated was the discussion about intergenerational leadership in spaces. So one of the things I think about, though, is that you do often get in the room when you have youth in the room, there's this tension. I want to be heard. Then there's a tension with the adults of like, I want to be respected. And I don't think we talk about that enough, because I also think that those are two valid points, right? Those are two valid points, and they're often considered in opposition to one another. So I'm wondering, in spaces where we do have meaningful intergenerational leadership, what does that look like? Especially when you're in a space where there is an older generation that did go through some stuff that we should be learning from, but there's also a younger generation that is going through some different stuff that connects, but it's different. I mean, and just the example of, I was having a conversation with some of my colleagues yesterday. I have like this split time of having no social media, no cell phone, all of that stuff, which thank God, for certain times of my life. And then now, having a generation that doesn't even know a time without an iPhone or an iPad or a Galaxy Pixel, right? How do we actually have meaningful intergenerational spaces when those tensions are existing?
Sorry. I mean, what you describe, I mean, we see that a lot, and it's normative, right? In a sense, I mean, in places where there is a kind of a deference, right? It's kind of expected, right? And there's a wait your turn mentality when it comes to young people involved in decision making. So that normative element, I mean, we do a lot of work with the adult power holders to help them, kind of at least recognize that, right? But then it becomes more of a procedural thing. So if we're in a room and we're talking about strategy or a specific tactic or whatever it is, I mean, there's a process. So how do we reach consensus on that, right? You don't automatically, just because you're older, get to make the determination, right? We'll listen to you, and your input is going to be valued, and maybe we will defer to you based on past experience, but there has to be a process through which we get to consensus. So I think in managing those spaces, I think, there's a critical role for an organizer or a facilitator who is experienced that can do that. And I think that helps. in the absence of that, I think it can break down quite quickly.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think about a word that's kind of come up repeatedly, which is listening. And it makes me think, Fantasy had talked about yesterday, the need when someone's having like emotional moment and just kind of letting them release and how that makes them feel better and open to feedback. And I think about that in terms of these spaces. A lot of times youth just want to feel heard and listened to. And once they receive that feeling, they can give you everything you want and more. And so I think there's a piece of just strategically letting them talk for, it sounds so simple, but I think it goes a long way in creating that foundation of I value your voice. And considering oftentimes young people don't feel like their voice is valued, having that as an onset provides that mutual respect. Because I think too, there's, I'm really interested in this idea of respect you brought up, because I think it's not talked about much, particularly for Black and Brown communities. Like respect is foundational. You cannot go around disrespecting. Yeah, respect is so important. And I think it's, given that it's foundational, it's often automatic in some communities when it comes to elders. And just then kind of going that extra mile and giving that space.
And I think like naming that, right? As opposed to like approaching it in the way of like, we got to do away with that, right? So like, I think of like, like in many like Latino, Latinx communities, right? Like respeto, familismo, like these are really important cultural values that like, I wouldn't dare tell my grandmothers, or I just wouldn't dare. So what does it look like to challenge, your family members when we come from a community where respeto and familismo are so critical to our family dynamics? And I think at first it's like naming that and not feeling the need that we have to remove that, right? That respeto, respect, familismo are so a part of like our culture and our family. You can have that. And what does it look like to be in community with the adults in your life where you are trying to push the envelope when it comes to like challenging adultism, which is a thing too.
Like the last piece is, especially because I've seen so often in classroom spaces where, I'll just kind of name it, I've seen it more with white teachers and Black students of this kind of like having youth voice where the kids have been acting a fool. And I'm like, I know you wouldn't speak to your people like, you know what I'm saying? And I don't think the teachers I've seen engaging in that, they're trying to do youth voice. But it's like this level of, to me, paternalism of like, you don't think they can communicate in a different way. So this is how, we can engage and have agency in respectful manners. And I think that's just a really important piece. So yeah, I appreciate you talking about respect because it's essential to these conversations for having.
Thank you. To the lady over here who was asking about connecting young people to other groups of young people, I wanted to recommend an organization called DoSomething.org, which is a great resource. And it's a place where different groups of young people can share what they are doing or participate with other groups of kids in projects that they care about. And they have a lot of resources, so I'd really recommend that. Another one is Students Demand Action. If your young people are interested in the issue of gun violence, addressing the issue of gun violence. But I did have a question for you all. Earlier we were talking about differentiating between the concepts of civic engagement and political engagement. And I think what I heard you saying was that it really perhaps doesn't matter, or you need to ask your groups whether it matters to them. And I wanted to challenge that a little bit because for out-of-school time providers, of course, they're operating in community contexts and they have a lot of different stakeholders, like their local board members, local government officials and politicians, local funders that they answer to. And it occurred to me that perhaps in navigating that and still trying to empower your young people to work on what they need to work on or what they want to work on, that those kind of considerations are real and they need to be navigated. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think I definitely can agree that they're real, and it's like how much do we put them in the forefront? Because we can get so caught up in the what are they defined as? And so I love the point you made just about like asking the community and like what does this mean to you, and then going from there. Because I think that goes again to the partnership. Like how can we co-define this together rather than kind of getting caught up in like, well, this our thought framework believes it's this way or this one, or instead like let's co-construct it together and then let's go to the next step.
Yeah. And I think ultimately, like operating from a perspective around like diverse forms of citizenship, right? Like the examples you provide are absolutely vital, right? Like whether we want to or not, like there's an active political system, right? There are laws being created and they impact us. So that is a form of engagement, but then also there are also these more micro forms of engagement, right? These conversations that are vital to getting to that point of this more political form of engagement, which is often seen as like the prime form of civic engagement. So diverse forms of citizenship are important. I think for me, ultimately, that what I was personally meaning around like what we call it, like I think for that, some people get caught up, is it civic or political? For me, when I was saying it doesn't matter, I think just in the naming for me, it doesn't matter. Like you're doing the work regardless.
All right, I think that brings us to our time. We'll pivot into a break. I'm guessing you're going to send us there. Thank you for your time.